Access in general practice is a really hotly debated topic, and how we manage that can be really challenging at times. And especially sometimes the clinicians don't often see what's happening, at the front of house and things. So in this episode, we're going to be joined by the team from IGPM, so particularly Robin, speaking about their experience and particularly that viral video that they've had going out and how this can all affect your team's working practice. Let's tech enhance your primary care and learning. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of the EGP Learning Podcast with myself and Andy. How are we doing there, Andy?
Yeah, good. Very good this morning, Andy. Hotly anticipating talking further about access in general practice.
Absolutely. And we've also joined by Robin from the IGPM. Want to say hello, Robin?
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me on.
No worries. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself so that our EGP learners can be aware of, what you do and the amazing work that you've been doing as well.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so I'm a practice manager in Bristol. We've got a 12,500 size practice. We're in a PCM with 4 other practices, and the clinical director sits in my surgery. I'm also kind of the lead PCN manager at the moment while we are waiting for our actual PCN manager to start. And I'm one of the founding members of the Institute of General Practice Management, which is an organisation that we set up, I think, about 6 months ago now, to actually represent practice managers as a profession. And to ensure that our voice gets heard in all the right places, and that practice managers' input is actually sought when designing services and looking at how we do things that impact on general practice.
Cool. And you guys have been up to some pretty cool stuff, particularly in the past 10 days or so. Want to tell us?
Yeah, so one of the themes that we were hearing a lot from our members and from other practice managers around the country were how the levels of abuse and aggression towards reception staff particularly have increased as the demand for appointments goes up, as the COVID rates come down. And our staff were just constantly coming to us saying they couldn't take any more. The kind of examples that were being given to us have been absolutely horrendous, and we just felt it's time to do something. We all have a zero tolerance policy in our practices, as does the whole of the NHS, but they felt that it wasn't enough by this point. And actually what we needed was a campaign to highlight what's happening and to say that it's not okay. And that, general practice staff are all there to just help patients as much as possible. And they find it as frustrating as patients when they can't. And there's just no reason ever to behave like we've seen in these examples towards reception staff. And I think it's had like 200,000 views now.
Yeah, so we're going to have a look at this viral video, aren't we, Andy? So I'll put it on the screen for you.
Yeah, let's see if we can play a bit of the audio as well. It's really, really impactful.
Mm-hmm.
If I die, it'll be your fault.
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 So you do answer the phone, eventually then?
I don't understand why it's so hard to get through. It's not like you're doing any work.
You're overreacting to this whole thing. It's just a bit of flu. Put me with the doctor now.
You're just a receptionist. Put me through to someone who knows what they're talking about.
Your receptionist is a Rottweiler and she won't let me see the doctor.
I pay your wages to give me what I want.
I'm entitled to see who I want, when I want.
Give me a vaccine or I complain to my MP and the CQC.
I've had my jab, so I'm immune. So give me an appointment.
The doctor shouldn't be on holiday and I need to speak to him.
You are absolutely useless, a lot of you.
I don't want to see the Indian doctor. I want to see the British one.
Do you want me to come in there and teach you how to do things better?
Ouch.
You're a
medication, so it'll be your fault if I die.
I need my pill prescription. If I get pregnant because I've missed it, then it's your fault.
If I don't get an appointment, I'm going to be down there and banging on that door until someone comes out and sees me.
I'm going to go down there right now and sort you out.
3 of our team had their tie slashed by a patient after we couldn't give him an appointment. He phoned at 5 p.m. and was offered an appointment the following day as we were fully booked.
Patient turned up at the surgery and threatened staff with a hammer because he couldn't get an appointment that suited him.
A Chinese member of staff was spat on and told to take the virus back home with them.
I hope all of your family die.
I know where you live. If I die, it'll be your fault.
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 Wow.
Yeah, impactful stuff. So, Robin, I came across this video in an interesting way, just to indicate how much impact this has had. My parents live in Sheffield, and they don't really have any other connection to general practice than myself. And they rang me up to say that on BBC Radio Sheffield, they were talking about this video that's been on YouTube and doing the rounds with people, with GP receptionists saying what horrible things people have said to them over the telephone. And they thought that I should see this video. So I think that just indicates the sort of impact that it's had. And one of our salaried GPs shared it on our practice WhatsApp group as well with the receptionists. So it's just really had a really wide ranging impact. And I think it probably is helping to shift some of the public perception. So it's like to thank you really for making the video. I think it's great.
Oh, that's great. And I think that's some of the feedback that we've had from reception staff, is that it's also highlighted to the clinical staff who don't necessarily see that front of house side of things, that this happens. And we've had a lot of teams come back and say our partners have come out to us and said, we had no idea things were this bad. And actually, we are going to make sure that we rigorously enforce that zero tolerance policy going forward, because you shouldn't have to put up with this. And that's one of the main things that we wanted, is the staff just want to feel like we've got their backs as managers and as GPs and partners, that we will support them when this happens.
I definitely agree. And as Andy mentioned, even despite all my connections on social media and stuff, I've still had loads of people send me, links to the video within our practice. I've had other members of staff sending it to me rather than me having to do anything to share it, which is unusual when it comes to practice media kind of stuff. But it's definitely had a wide-ranging impact, and particularly with the staff hopefully feeling more supported to understand that this is a recognised issue. And absolutely agree that the clinicians often don't see the volume and the severity of the comments that come through. We get obviously when it comes to our room, but there's obviously steps before that happens, and absolutely the impact it must have on our staff, I think, is something that shouldn't be forgotten. So really, again, thank you for creating it. I guess there's also a lot of support and kind of comments about how impactful it can be. There's always going to be people that also feel that this is possibly a wrong message to be sharing, the wrong tone. I mean, what are your thoughts on those comments that have happened that talk about that particular part that is taking it obviously from one view kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't had many. We've had from within the profession, we've had a few people say, maybe we should have sort of put a positive message on the end about how much has been done. And we have, so there is a longer version of the video available from our page, which actually has some stats in it to sort of reinforce that general practice is definitely open and we are seeing patients. And, in a world where you can be anything, you should be kind. But I think the problem is for too long, we almost become apologetic. And actually what we felt was this time what we needed was something to say, this definitely is not okay. It happens. It's not all right. And we can't keep letting it happen either. Our staff need us to stand up and represent them and show them that we will not take it from people, because it's not all right. And I think the most of the comments we've had from the public have actually been quite positive. So I posted it on my own practice's Facebook page, and the majority of comments were, I'm astonished that this is what your staff go through. I mean, one of my receptionists is in that video, and I think people saw that and it really hit home for them, because it's not just oh, this happens in a different practice, not in my practice. One of the comments was one of the comments that one of my staff had received. So I think that made people stop and think, well, actually, maybe this is not the right way to treat staff. They are just trying to help you.
Yeah, so Robin, I think it's a really great way to sort of promote and launch what's a fairly new organisation as well. I just had a question about IGPM, because there's been all sorts of different organisations to kind of attempting to help support practice managers for a while, like Practice Manager Index, for example, and these sorts of things. And it feels like your organisation is different, and certainly I couldn't imagine a video like this coming from one of those other organisations. And I was just wondering sort of how you came to the conclusion that practice managers needed a new or an additional or another organisation, and kind of what need you're attempting to fill. I think there is a need. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering what your thought process was.
Yeah, so the four of us were sort of pushed together back in November, because we were all we all use Practice Index. We're quite vocal on it. I do some blogs for them. I've done some podcasts for Ockham Health and stuff in the past. And the four of us in our own little silos were just all sort of complaining about the same things and just saying how, practice managers were excluded from the new to partnership scheme. Practice managers don't get involved or get consulted around changes. When they brought out the PCN there was no practice manager input into that whole spec. And trust me, we have a lot to say about it. There's also a survey that we posted on Practice Index because it was getting so stressful trying to carry on through COVID. We asked people how many of you are thinking of leaving in the next 12 months. And out of the respondents, an astonishing 66% said that they were actually thinking of leaving or had already resigned from their post, which then flags up, we talk about GP succession planning crisis. What happens if you've got no practice manager? Who runs the practice for you? So we all kind of got together and just, well, what can we do about it? And first we were talking about, there's no specific union for practice managers, and that's not really what we're about. What we want is to represent our profession, to have our profession actually recognised as a profession, because initially we were told we weren't covered by the new to partnership scheme because we're not a recognised profession, which is a bit of a slap in the face. We then basically went out to other practice managers, said, if you had an organisation, what would you want it to do? And what came back was they want a voice at the table. They want to be consulted about things that are going to impact on primary care services and how we help deliver them. They want to be recognised. They want accreditation and professional status. And so these are all the things that we're trying to do. And I know there are other organisations out there who support practice managers, but this is not just support, it's representation as well. So that's kind of what we're after. And we are a not-for-profit organisation. We're run solely by jobbing practice managers. All of us four and the directors are full-time practice managers as well. So it's been a bit hectic trying to get everything together in the last 6 months. But yeah, we've come a long way, and I think we've got a longer way to go yet.
Yeah,
I think probably just to give a couple of shout outs as well with that. So technically Practice Index have been supporting, I know the IGPM in delivering a lot of this. So I think they kind of got you guys, supported you guys.
Yeah, so we were all talking on Practice Index forums, and James Dillon, who's one of the managers of Practice Index, sort of said, oh, Robin, you should talk to Joe, and we should talk to Kay, and then you should all talk to Nick. And then that's kind of how it's gone on from there. And they're still providing us with a bit of admin support as well, which is really helpful.
Sure. And I guess shout out also to our fellow colleague, Ben Gowan from the General Practice podcast at Ockham Health and stuff. Because I believe the first time all four of you kind of got together was on his podcast, if I remember rightly. And that kind
officially,
and that kind of triggered the discussions. And then from there, it just snowballed into this amazing institution. And I can see Andy showing particularly the recent episode that both me and Robin were on and talking about that letter. And we're not going to go into more detail on that because we've talked about it lots, and
we've talked at length about that letter before.
So if you do want to have a listen, feel free to go do so. It's an amazing episode, and I've no declarations of interest with that apart from about a minute, along with Robin. But just a couple of shout outs to those two, organisations and groups. Because I think they've definitely been part of that journey.
Absolutely, yeah.
However, not taking away the amazing amount of work that you guys have done for setting up the IGPM, because having set up organisations in the past, it's a huge amount of work. It really is. So yeah.
I think it does look like you're doing something different and additional and needed as well with the Institute of General Practice Management. So so best of luck to you. And
thank you.
Presumably, if practice managers listening, we normally do this at the end, but what's the best way to find you guys? Just search on Google or?
So we've got a website. It's igpm.org.uk. If you want to sign up and become a member, there's a membership page on there. Everything that we do, we post our updates, but we're also very active on social media, so you can find us on Twitter and Facebook and LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, you've got your amazing PM Power kind of sessions, haven't you? Which definitely are really just it's nice, lack of better term. It's a nice way of trying to support, particularly those that may not have had a great deal of focus in the past. But I know we wanted to talk a little bit more about access in general practice. And it's a key hot topic. I guess the first thing to talk about is obviously what exactly is the problem, Andy, do you want to take us through it?
Yeah, so access in general practice has been a problem for a long time. I mean, even before COVID, we were having all sorts of discussions about the difficulties people have accessing their GP or their GP practice services in a way that they feel they want or that meets their their needs or their expectations, all sorts of discussions around that. Medical demand is almost unsatiable, isn't it? There is, it feels to those of us who provide general practice services, like no matter how much capacity we put in place, it's very difficult to meet people's demands, their needs, and their expectations. And this causes a lot of tension and friction. What I'm interested actually is to know is from your perspective, Robin, because Gandhi and I, obviously, we sit in the GP surgery and we have a certain perspective on the demand issue, but your experience will be different. You're closer to the front of house, closer to the reception staff, which are the first point of contact than we are. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about the supply demand mismatch issue, and like how you experience it and how that might be different to how we experience it.
Yeah, I think demand has absolutely gone through the roof recently. I think from our experience, a lot of patients who are calling up are sort of saying, oh, I've had this problem for a while, but you've been really busy with COVID and with vaccines and I didn't want to bring it up, but now I feel like it can't wait any longer. But the problem is they're now all saying that. So we've got a big rush of people wanting to come in and be seen, but we're not having any more capacity. We don't have any funding to bring in more staff. Even if we did, could we even get any more GPs? There's a massive shortage out there of staff to even call on. So I think that's quite difficult, whilst also trying to manage the vaccination program, which a lot of us are really heavily involved in, and obviously has an impact on staff and numbers. I just think there's too much demand, not enough capacity, and there hasn't really been a lot that can help with that. I mean, recently we've tried so many things, and I'm sure practices across the country would agree. You do care navigation, you signpost, so you try and get patient in with the most appropriate person, which sometimes might not even be in the surgery. We've done admin workflow, so doctors don't have to do so many documents anymore, which should be able to free up capacity for appointments. We've tried many schemes and things that are supposed to reduce the administrative burden, take out unnecessary appointments, and it's not doing anything anymore. The demand is now just like stripping what we've got.
Gandhi, I'm interested. You talk a lot about access and demand in general practice, and we often turn to some kind of key stats, don't we, in terms of general practice does 90% of the consultations in the NHS, receives 10% of the funding. We're one of those areas of the health system that has a sort of open door. There's ourselves, there's A&E, perhaps a few other examples, and patients can just contact us and ask for attention from us and for appointments. Other parts of the NHS are protected by general practice and by A&E and their access via referrals from other practitioners who manage the demand. So demand management is a really key part of general practice. The demand goes up and down based on different times of the year, different circumstances. We're currently having a surge post-COVID, but the funding and resources sort of always stays pretty constant, and generally doesn't go up or keep pace with demand and capacity. We talk about COVID currently, but there's also some major underlying trends in the population, such as an aging population. People are living longer with multiple more complex medical conditions. People just need more care. So even before COVID, we were having these debates and conversations about how resources aren't keeping up with the not just demand, but the need. I mean, demand has a combination of expectation and need, doesn't it? And we often separated those out pre-COVID. It feels to me like the conversation has really shifted from what it was pre-COVID as well, because I think we were having some sensible conversations with politicians and policymakers about making the best use of resources to meet need and how to ensure that there was appropriate use of consultations and resources. And it seems crazy to me at the moment that's sort of gone out the window, and we're just talking about meeting patients' expectations, and that's become the focus of the debate. Patients should be able to contact their GP surgery day or night about anything. And in some respects, I feel everybody has gone a little bit crazy, and that we should return to some of those more sensible conversations about access. It feels very politically driven to treat patients as a consumer and give them everything they want so that they vote for, for a political party. I would say we don't normally get, whatever the political party is, the NHS has always been a political football. I'm going to get off. I'm going to get off this track now, and we can. Sorry, it's starting to get a bit ranty, but that's the danger with these very emotive topics, isn't it? I'm going to back away.
Okay, well, I think it's exemplified by Roger's comment that's come through that your point is correct. GP was in crisis before COVID, and COVID, to be honest, has just literally poured a can of gasoline on top of the fire that was already burning, and made it into this absolute blaze that is just now so out of control. And yet, what we're talking about and what we're being asked to do is look at it from a glass window, basically saying, "Oh, look, there's a fire over there." Yeah, we're going to ignore that though, and we're going to focus on just making sure that there's enough fuel to make sure it keeps going, kind of thing. So yeah,
I've got a question for both for both of you. So there's a real mismatch, it feels, between the reality that we're living in GP surgeries, which is actually we're delivering more activity than we ever have before. We're delivering in most parts of the country COVID vaccination programs and dealing with a surge of demand, which we are attempting to cope with. And it feels like we've never been busier, and actually some of the activity statistics do back that up. But the perception from the public and the stories that you see in the paper and see in Panorama on the BBC are that general practice is closed, it's not accessible, GP surgeries are not seeing patients or doing what they should. I'm just wondering what the two of you think is driving that mismatch, because it feels like it's never been this bad before in terms of the difference between perception and reality.
You want to go for it, Robin?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know. I think part of it is about how surgeries communicate with their patients. I think right at the beginning, when we went into our first lockdown, everyone was absolutely terrified. You didn't know what was going to happen. We were being told that you should not basically go out of your house unless you absolutely have to. PPE was awful. The shortage was terrible. Teams were absolutely terrified of catching the virus and passing it amongst their teams, and then basically shutting the whole surgery down, which would be terrible for the patients who were looking for those services. But I think how that was then communicated is different, varying from place to place. I know from my perspective, the first thing I thought was, if patients don't know what's happening, we can't expect them to know how they can still access us. We don't want them turning up unnecessarily and putting themselves and our staff at risk. So we need to be really open and transparent. But I think a lot of other practices, for whatever reason, if they didn't have the capacity to or the means to do that, weren't able to, and that probably hasn't helped. But again, as the point that's made in the chat, there was a problem before COVID. The GPs and primary care get lambasted in the media more than any other part of the health service. And it feels like no matter what we do, it's never the right thing. And it's always the people who are unhappy that shout the loudest. The people who are happy don't tend to go to social media or the papers and talk about what a great service they've received. So I think there is definitely an imbalance in how it's reported.
Definitely agree with you. And I think, Andy, you made this point last time when we talked about remote consultations. There is a currency that you have with patient engagement. So every time you chat to somebody, you strengthen, you deepen that connection that you have with that person. And when you do that face to face, that connection is so much more evident and personal, for lack of better terms. And when general practice had to change the way it did things, because it was instructed to, be absolutely clear on this point, it was the right instruction as well at the time. I'll be clear on that point as well. That many patients then felt, well, I can't physically see my practice team, my GP, my nurse in front of me, so I've now got a different way of interacting with them. But generally speaking, the majority of patients that are very vocal still feel that that's not an interaction with the practice. That's not a consultation. I've not seen my GP, therefore I've had no contact with my GP, despite the fact they may have had various contacts with the practice or the GP team or the GP themselves through other routes. They don't feel they've had contact, so therefore they feel the practice is shut. And I think because of that lack of currency that's there in terms of that emotional and connection and all that kind of stuff, that's why people buy into this whole fake media part that general practice is shut. And let's absolutely clear, it is fake media. It is a myth that has been perpetuated by the media organisations that general practice is shut. General practice is never shut. We may have changed the way that patients come to the practice, That is different to general practice being shut. In actual fact, when COVID was really kicking off, most practices actually opened extra hours. They were open over bank holiday weekends and that kind of stuff. Additionally, we just did things different, and because it's different, people then say, "Well, you're not doing anything," and that's been really, to be honest, hurtful to many. And I think that's why. And I know we said we wouldn't talk about it. That letter pissed off so many people. But yeah.
To give you a real life example, I was having lunch with my own mother last Sunday, and she'd seen the video and she was talking. And the first thing she said to me was, "Well, I can't see anyone at my GP practice, and I haven't done this whole time." And I said, "You have a monthly blood test?" And she said, "Yes." And I said, "At your surgery?" "Yes." "Okay. Have you actually asked for a GP appointment?" And she said, "No." But I said, "How can you say that? How can you say that you've not had any contact from your practice and you still had your regular treatment and you've not needed them for anything else?"
I'm going to agree with you there, Robin, because my mum as well was saying, I can't get to see anyone at my general practice. It must be always mums, maybe. But actually, during the last few months, she's been successfully diagnosed as being a new hypertensive patient. So she's been newly diagnosed with high blood pressure. She's been successfully started on one medication, and then she had to change that due to side effects and move to another medication that's required blood tests and titration of that medication up. And she's had several appointments at the GP surgery. She's spoken to a GP on the telephone. She hasn't seen them. She didn't need to see the GP at all. She needed her blood pressure doing and her blood tests and her ECG and whatnot. But her perception of that actually quite good experience that I think she's had with her GP surgery was one of disappointment. And that was really interesting to me.
And I think that's what we're dealing with, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's the realization that many of the public haven't grasped just yet. And a lot of this is down to really poor PR. And I am going to lay some of the blame of this at the various organizations around us. They've done a really crap job, let's be honest, of explaining the situation. So that includes NHS England, that includes the RCGP, and to be honest, the BMA as well. That general practice has changed. Okay, it is not the service that many people wish they still had from 5 or 10 years ago, that you have that deep and personal connection with one clinician for the rest of your life. That is not what general practice is going to be moving forward. There isn't the number of staff to maintain that. The job itself is so much more chaotic and busy that for clinicians to be delivering that kind of service is the fastest way for them to burn out. And in addition, the funding doesn't support it as well. So we've got more funding for additional roles, none of which are GPs, none of which are practice nurses, none of which are practice managers. So, those key roles aren't part of the ones additional roles. There are some other roles that I think can have real benefit to general practice, but they're not those ones that patients often ask for because that's what they're used to asking for. And that change hasn't really been communicated really well. And the fact that, the way that you approach your practice with online methods and stuff can mean a positive journey. It's just going to be different to the journey that you've had before, and expecting the same process that happened even before COVID. And COVID just supercharged everything by a couple of years. That's all that's happened. That's the expectation that needs to change. Sorry, go for it, Andy.
I was going to say, I've noticed, I think it's quite a good, quite technical question in the chat, and I'm interested to know all of our thoughts on it. So Chris A has asked, how do you measure demand at your practice? Number of phone calls, footfall, etc. So I think that's really important, because if we're having this conversation about how big demand is and how we're struggling to meet it, that's a really, really legitimate question. So, I mean, the sort of things we do at our practice are we look at the number of phone calls, and we have like a screen that shows the receptionist what's the real-time activity on the telephones and how busy things are and so forth. And we have access to that data afterwards. We always, so that gives an indication of who's potentially bouncing off the telephones, who's not staying on the line long enough to even tell us that they want to speak to us. And then when someone successfully gets through and asks for an appointment, even if we can't provide one, we leave a code and a note in the notes so that we can see how many people have asked for appointments, even if we haven't been able to deliver them, because it's difficult to look at the appointment ledger and know, that doesn't tell you your demand, that tells you your capacity, doesn't it? So those are the sorts of things that we do, and occasionally, but not recently, we'll do an audit of what type of thing people wanted when they rang us and when they wanted that in the week, and whether it was urgent or not, and so forth. So we'll do periodic audits to give us some awareness of what our demand is and how well we're meeting it. What do you guys do?
Similar. So we have a protocol that our receptionists use when they're signposting which will code, where the patient was booked in with, or if the patient was unable to be booked. We also can look at sort of what the wait for a routine appointment is with our GPs. So in terms of people wanting a routine consultation, if your wait is going up and up and up, then that for us is an indication that demand is exceeding our capacity. And obviously we count the number of appointments that we book up each day. There was an interesting point about footfall into the practice, and that's actually something that we don't really measure. And maybe we should, because I think if you're struggling to get through on the phones, there are probably lots of people who would just turn up at the surgery, especially if your doors are open now, which most of us are. So yeah, that might be another way of capturing that kind of data going forward.
Yeah, I think there's a variety of different ways you can do it. So if you're looking for tech options, so basic ones, have a look at your Google My Business profile and see how many hits you're getting just on people Googling your practice. That's normally a good indicator of how busy you might potentially be, because what's the first way somebody will find your practice number or find out where your opening times, all that kind of, that pre-contact demand. Google, to be honest, is probably the best way of figuring that out. Like you say, having telephone or online consultation systems that help to track the number of contacts that you have. So telephone systems can do that. A lot of the online consultation providers will be able to give you metrics in terms of the number of people that make contact, the number of people that don't continue the forms and all that kind of stuff in terms of the contact, and then obviously the volume coming through. And there are actually other systems you can even look at. So quite a few tech kind of things look at pure demand management. Once you integrate them within your systems, can give you possibly more deeper and more meaningful metrics about the types of volume demand that you've got. Or you could just go standard pen and paper. How many people called on the day? How many people in appointments? Like Andy said, the kind of audit thing. That's the old-fashioned way of doing it. I do remember a few years back, and Andy will probably remember this, back in Nottingham, the CCG commissioned a particular company to do an evaluation of, kind of the way that access was working in general practice. And it was partly to look at their model that they provided. And I remember them saying that back then, and bearing in mind this was about 6 years ago, I think it was, wasn't it, Andy? They used to say that you will never have more contact than 10% of your practice population in a week. It's impossible. They've never seen it happen. It would never happen at all. When we did the audit at that time, following their clear instructions of how to do it, the first time we did it, we had 12%. Okay? They didn't believe the figures because they said it's impossible. You've done it wrong. I'm like, okay, fine. So they made us do it again because they were absolutely convinced that, we'd done it wrong. And so we did it again on a bank holiday weekend, which is, as many people know, different type of contact you get, particularly in terms of way things. And they said that the highest they'd ever had was 8%. That was the highest they'd ever had. So bearing in mind, we did a quieter period of, generally speaking, in general practice, we still had 9.5%. And that was several years ago. Now it is just, the past few weeks have been chaos. I'm not hidden that. I think about 3-4 weeks ago, I had probably the busiest day I've ever had in general practice, to the point where it's the closest I've actually come to saying I've had enough. And that's where I think many practices are right now, and it's really hard to deal with it. Demand, hard to evaluate, because the other problem we've got, no one's got one metric that they use.
No.
There isn't a unified way of checking it. There might be with the GP appointment data stuff that's coming through, and I know lots of people are really annoyed about this stuff. We've talked about it a few times, haven't we, Andy? And we've got a great video if people want to have a look at what exactly it is in more detail. And actually, the first deadline is the end of June, so 30 days time from today. So if you haven't looked at it already, people, you need to kind of do so. But I think that possibly could offer some option of standardizing what demand is like in general practice, or potentially better what capacity is like in general practice. Probably a more accurate marker. Yeah, it's fun. Just before we go on to another topic though, Andy, and we've had a quick question that probably you can answer. What's the code you use for requested appointments?
I cannot answer that question because I cannot remember, because it's sort of automated in a template that they use, a bit like the signposting template that Robin decided. And I think we put it in place actually a few years ago. And what we do when we want to use a read code in the practice is we tend to find something that just about describes what's happened in terms of the real text content of the code, and that we're confident is not used by anyone else anywhere in order to pollute the data. So it's probably something like had a chat with a receptionist, or something that isn't actually directly related to demand management, but we are confident it's not used elsewhere. So obviously that's no good and we're no good if we're expecting NHS England to extract that or anything like that. But for our own internal searches on System 1, that's quite useful for us. Hopefully that's helpful.
That's Dave. Then, if you ask either me or Andy outside of this on Facebook, and we'll try and get that information to you later on. But unfortunately, we don't have it at hand. But yeah. Sorry. Apparently, we've been told that our sound keeps cutting in and out. Apologies if that's happening. I'm not sure if that was me or Andy, but it might be me because I move around a lot. So hopefully that should be better. Yeah. So we've had another question. Are there any other metrics used in secondary care settings that GPs could compare to secondary care data? We shouldn't need to reinvent the wheel and how busy we are. I think the simple answer to that is no.
I think it's really, it strikes me that it should be easier for secondary care to understand their demand, particularly outside of the A&E context, because they have referrals and they know how many referrals they have in from GP or A&E. So it strikes me it's probably easier to understand, and they have a lot of metrics, don't they, around waiting times and so forth, which I'm sure they find quite useful, at least to have an understanding of what their situation is, and that allows them actually to perhaps more successfully argue for resources as well, if they can demonstrate what their demand is and do so with confidence in a way that other people have confidence in. I mean, we've been talking about how difficult it is to measure demand in general practice, and I think that makes it difficult to then argue for resources, or at least harder than they might find it in certain areas of secondary care.
I mean, hospital trusts have the benefit as well of having whole teams who look at their activity, don't they? Who analyse their output and make sure they get paid for all the activity that they do. I used to work in a community provider as well that had a similar performance team that used to make sure that patients were being followed up and that the treatment times, referral times were down. In general practice, you probably just have like one administrator who looks at something like that.
Yeah, absolutely right. So I was gonna just move us forwards a little bit, because we've been articulating what the problem is. I'm just wondering what we all really have seen people doing to try and address the problem, and what might have been successful, or what we've seen and perhaps doesn't work very well. That's often really, really useful information, so people know to not try particular things unless they're really, really attracted to them. Yeah, Robin, what sort of things have you seen being done that are either successful or unsuccessful?
People will bang on about care navigation or active signposting or whatever you want to call it all the time, but it is an actually really, really useful program to do. It helps educate patients around, especially around all the new roles that you might have in your practice. If you've brought PCN staff in and people don't know what they do, it's an opportunity to explain that to patients. The community pharmacy pilot scheme, is running across the NHS England, I think, at the moment in various areas, and that's been quite helpful in sending non-urgent demands that can be dealt with in the community through to a pharmacist rather than having a GP appointment. So yeah, I'm a big fan of care navigation. Where it works well, then it can have a massive impact. Document workflow. So I expect lots of people are probably familiar with this by now. It's just having, most of the letters that come through into general practice don't need any action, don't need any review by a GP. So that's really helped the administrative burden in my practice. And pathology workflow as well. Having someone trained to manage and file normal results that come through within certain parameters, again, which means it doesn't need to have a clinician look over it. The aim of which obviously is to reduce the admin burden and free up time for appointments. So those are probably my top three, I think.
Absolutely. And I think, with a lot of that kind of contact and things, different practices, I think, have invested different amount of times into how they do those various aspects. If I can pick up on the one that you mentioned at the start, that whole care navigation aspect, particularly with the video, we saw episodes and, kind of contacts where, patients felt that they're having to share their history with, the reception team, and that they don't want to do that. Or the reception team are asking stuff they shouldn't be allowed to ask. I know our views on that. I'm keen to know your view, and particularly the view from, how the reception team take that kind of information and what it means. I hope you kind of get what I'm getting at. But
yeah, I think one of the main themes that we hear all the time, and that my receptionists are very astute at picking up, is when you phone 999 and you tell the person on the end of the phone what your problem is, that person is not a clinician. They're a call handler. When you phone 111 and they go through that incredibly lengthy algorithm that we've all seen come out in our 111 reports, that person is not a clinician, they're a call handler. Why is it okay for patients to give this information to a complete stranger who isn't medically trained than to give the same information to a receptionist in a surgery that you actually have a relationship with, whose role is to then make sure that information goes to the right person to get you the right care the first time that you contact?
You know what? I've never even thought about that, to be honest.
That's a really good way of explaining it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you're preaching to the choir here, but that's a really good way to get that point across to patients, I think. I know this is a battle we had at our practice but a few years ago, and just in case other people are currently moving in this direction or fighting this battle, I think it is winnable. Actually, we had a few years ago. We moved to a policy where we wanted our patients to tell our receptionists or give them an indication as to what the nature of the problem was, so that they can better help connect them with the right help, whether that was within the practice or whether it was a signposted destination. And they got a lot of friction initially, and we got pushback from the patient group, but we stuck to our guns, and we supported the receptionists with some sort of suggested dialogues and lines of argument like you've just given to help educate patients. And we did some videos and various other things, and we've won that now, and patients never complain about being asked by the receptionist what the nature of the problem is. Sometimes they won't say, and they'll say it's personal, and that's fine.
That's fine, yeah.
But it is winnable. And then once you have that in place, it opens up so many other possibilities in terms of signposting and profiling that demand in a way that allows better use of resources within the practice, and also connects the patient with what they need better. And actually, we were able to give the patient group and patients examples of where people had said, oh, my speech is slurred, I've got some weakness on one half of my body. We had some really, really good success stories of receptionists picking up serious illness and getting people in touch with the emergency services quicker. So definitely winnable.
Agree. And I think one of the things I often ask my reception staff to also mention is when somebody feels it's not something they want to share with the reception staff, they do comment that the clinicians do use this information to triage how quickly they contact patients. If they're not sure how urgent it is, they will assume that you're happy for this to wait till they have dealt with potentially the more urgent clinical things, because you felt it's not urgent enough to need to share that information. So if you want to, we're happy to put that down. And I found that for a lot of patients, that helps to emphasize the fact that actually that information is used to help direct the clinicians what they do with the case. It's not because the receptionist is being nosy, which is the wrong attitude, I think, for many patients. It's not that. But I love, Robin, your explanation of actually they would do that if they contacted 999 or 111 with a drop of a hat, and yet for some reason that with the reception team seems to be a real barrier. So I think that's something to explore a bit more.
I think one of the things that we tried to do as well is how you ask the question. So my team were trained not to ask what the problem is. The patient rings up and says, I need an appointment. And the first question the receptionist asks is, when do you think you need to be seen? So it not only gives you an indication of how urgent the problem is, but quite often it then spurs the patient on to tell you what the problem is without having to be directly asked. So we find that's a nice way of sort of getting around that. But like you say, if patients refuse to tell us, that's fine. We're not going to push you, but it will mean that it's going to make it harder, like you say, Gandhi, to put you in the right place, or to be seen as quickly as you may need to if you're not willing to tell us what the problem is. You wouldn't phone 999 and say, I need an ambulance, but I'm not going to say why.
Yeah, true. I think that care navigation part is an absolutely important part. Many clinicians don't know what half the ARS roles can do. So how do we expect our patients to know, to be honest? And, getting them to see the right person for the right reason, just as much as we want them to see, the roles for the right reason. We don't want them seeing the GPs for the wrong reason and vice versa, but getting them to the right place at the right time. The only way we can do that is if we get the right information and you have somebody that knows what those roles can do. And patients don't know, because we don't know half the time. Many of my colleagues don't know what half the roles could do, and even then, what they could do is very independent on that particular type of person in that role. So that, the type of OT they may be, for example, there's going to be, various different types that have different skills and that kind of stuff. Just like nurses, one nurse in a practice does not necessarily do the same job that another nurse in another practice or even in the same practice does. So understanding that complexity, that's where care navigation is really, really important.
Robin, I've got a question for you. So Gandhi and I have talked a lot about technology and online demand management tools and so forth. But from your practice manager perspective and that of your members, if you've begun to get some input from them on this, I was just wondering what your experience or views are on the online demand management. So I'm really talking about those products where the patient's encouraged to fill in an online form, and then that's processed somehow within a process at the practice. How have you? What's your experience of those?
I think from what we hear from our members, it's massively variable across the country. So my practice uses e-consult. We are actually finding it okay. We probably don't have as many e-consults as we do phone calls. Patients sort of tend to use it if we can't get them an appointment, because it will just give them a response, whether it's, well, we can book you in another time, or actually you can see somebody else for this. It's quite helpful for we treat e-consult as if it were a phone call in terms of care navigation as well. So if something comes in that can go to the community pharmacist scheme, we'll refer it on just as we would as if they'd phoned through. But for some practices, I'm hearing that the demand is just completely skyrocketed because patients have turned to the electronic consulting because they can't get through on the phones. And as the demand has doubled, then so has the electronic demand. I'm hearing of practices who have begged their CCGs to turn it off on the weekends because they're coming back on a Monday morning to an absolute deluge and they just can't respond within the timeframes that they're supposed to. So I think there is a place for it, but I think it needs to be understood by the powers that be that you've opened the floodgates in a lot of places, and something needs to be done because we're defenseless behind them.
Robin, how might a practice know so the experience is variable, and there might not be an answer to this, but how might a practice know whether it's for them or not?
I think it depends on the makeup of your team and the type of clinicians that you've got in. There are some people who are quite happy to have a form filled out that has all the information they feel that they need, and they can go on from there. There are other clinicians who might look at that and think, well, this is telling me lots of things, but what is it not telling me? And actually, I benefit more from speaking to this patient anyway, or seeing them face to face. And you have to also think about the demographics of your patients. If you don't have lots with online access, if you don't have a lot of people who are articulate enough in saying what their problems are, you could be missing a lot of information. So I think it's very individualistic, and I think each practice, when they take it on, need to think, how are we going to use this, and how do we want to use it so that it's going to have the maximum benefit. But I think it's another one of those things that it gets sort of foisted on general practice with not a lot of notice, not a lot of training, and you just kind of have to run with it, which doesn't make it the most effective that it could be.
I've got an opinion, Gandhi. Can I
Yeah, you go first, and I'll jump in.
My opinion is I think that these are they are what they say on the tin, in terms of I think they're demand management solutions. So I think they're not solutions to capacity problems. And I think if there's a practice that has a significant capacity problem and a really big mismatch between genuine demand and need and the capacity, these probably make things worse, is my opinion. Whereas if there's a practice that actually is closer to meeting the demands and has less of a capacity issue, then I think it can really help them be more effective at getting that demand to the right place. That's my opinion, and I think that's where practices and CCGs and those people who commission these things need to be careful and realize which problem they're trying to solve. If it's a capacity problem, then I think actually you need more capacity, and that sometimes means more resources going into that unit to help with the capacity, or restructuring them in a meaningful way. If it's a kind of an access and demand management issue, and you want to improve patients' experience of access, then I think actually they're really good products for that. But I'm going to stick my neck out and say that's my opinion, and that's where people should be cautious. Gandhi, any thoughts before we probably move on from this? We've covered it a lot before.
So I think the way that practices introduce these kind of products and stuff, and these access routes to patients and the practice, have to be looked at from both those perspectives. So first of all, what is the likelihood of demand that you're going to get through with patients? So if you work in an area where there's low use of tech, low availability of the tech, and the population is unlikely to use it, you're not going to notice anything. Whereas if you work in an area where it's high functioning generally, high access to tech and good digital inclusion elements, you're probably going to have a large uptake. Next question is then, how are you going to integrate that within your practice? So is this going to be the main route of contact for your patients, or is this going to be an additional route of contact for your patients? And then how that works in the practice, what is the setup you're going to have to manage that demand? If you're just going to start this and hope that it'll come through and it'll be okay, yeah, then that's not going to work. You have to actually think about how this stuff's going to come through, and then who is the best person to deal with those contacts, and if that's going to be the GP, how are you going to change that GP's workload to allow them to do that? Because if you just, again, bolt it on, it's not going to work, because they're just going to have an extra 20 jobs to do when they're already doing 100 kind of things. Whereas if you have potentially admin teams, clinical admin teams, or even GPs, but then that's what they're doing for the majority of that point, it's likely to work more successfully because you're changing the back end systems to accommodate the change in the way that things are coming through. And I think that's where many practices have really fallen down, because we were told to start total triage within the space of a week or two. They've just bolted it on, and now they're dealing with the fact they haven't done the back end system change in the practice to deal with that workflow, and that's why they're so overwhelmed. However, do not get me wrong, the demand has absolutely gone up, and that combination of those two things is why so many practices are just like, can't cope with this.
Yeah.
So, yeah. As you said, we do need to move on. I guess, what would you like to tackle next, Andy? Because I'm aware of...
Well, so just coming back to where we started in a way with the video, and that those really difficult things that the receptionists are hearing, that sometimes the clinical staff hear, but I think it's the receptionists that take the brunt of patients' dissatisfaction with probably the whole of the NHS, and sometimes elements of their life which are outside of our control as well, but certainly with general practice services. The staff really suffer, and it must have a real impact on morale, and I know it does. Robin, what can practice managers, but also GPs or people or practice nurses or people in more leadership positions do to help support staff and the practices in the face of that?
I think the biggest thing that can be done is, you've got that zero tolerance policy, we all do. We have to rigorously enforce it. The thing that receptionists complain to me the most about is when this happens, there's never seems to be any ramifications for the patient. And that's what really gets their morale down, is that they are then feeling they have to sit there and they have to take it, and there's nothing that will get done about it, and we cannot let this continue. I'm in my practice, I'm very quick with a warning letter. I'm very quick to follow that up if someone continues to abuse my staff, because that's not what they're there for, and they do not deserve that. And we wouldn't have that in any other part of the NHS. Why should we put up with it in general practice? We absolutely shouldn't. And I think what we need is a unified voice from the partners, from the surgeries. You are the owners of these businesses. You are the people who decide whether a service gets provided to our patients or not. If you all walked away, there wouldn't be one. So you need to embrace that and say, and be able to back the receptionist up with confidence to say, we're not going to tolerate that kind of behaviour. I think we need to communicate more with patients in a way to try and reduce the stress and the anxiety that they may be feeling. I think a lot of people don't understand actually how general practice works. They don't understand what the problems are or why there is an issue with access. So we need to be open and transparent with them and just say, this is how much our capacity is, and this is how much our demand has increased recently, and this is what we're trying to do to address it. And these are all the things that you can do to try and help us manage that demand as well. So I think that's a really key thing. And I think there is training out there for staff, and there are wellbeing programs, and I think there's a lot of pastoral support that practice managers put into their teams that I think the rest of the clinical team need to take part in as well, because you've only got one practice manager in a lot of places, and they can't support everyone all the time, but if no one is supporting them too. So it's a whole team approach. Everyone needs to do what they can to support each other. Take some time out to let staff debrief on wind down after something bad has happened. I think too often our receptionists will take a load of abuse, they'll put the phone down, and then the phone will ring and they'll pick it up and they'll do it all again. There needs to be a bit of appreciation that sometimes they might need to step away for a few minutes just to have someone to talk to vent to, and to just, regroup. I think that's very important. So yeah, definitely a lot of pastoral support needs to go in from the whole team.
Yeah.
Yeah,
picking
no,
up on one
I
of the
agree with that last point, if that's all right, Andy. To many of the clinicians probably listen to this, that last point is the basis of housekeeping, which we're all taught about in terms of consultation models and stuff. That if you've just had really emotional or empathic consultation, sometimes you just need to take a bit of a break to reset yourself before you can crack on and do the next one. And not forgetting that our reception staff deal with easily double, triple, potentially sometimes even 10 times the volume of calls and contacts that GPs deal with. So you're not forgetting that element of well-being that comes with it. Sorry, Andy, go for it.
No, that's a very good point, Gandhi. I was just reflecting on something quite interesting happens when we get our whole team together and we get to talking about these sorts of things and the sorts of things patients say to receptionists. And often the clinicians are surprised how bad it is. And actually, they very quickly start backing up the receptionists in terms of how they can respond. And they said, why don't you just put the phone down? It's okay not to take that, because sometimes I think receptionists are, if it's not clear that that's the policy or that that's what the expectation from the clinicians and the partners are in terms of how they should respond to that, I think they feel that they need to keep listening and that they need to keep trying to help beyond the point at which they can't help that patient on that phone call. That phone call is gone. It's gone beyond the point where it's going to be therapeutic. So I think just the whole team talking to each other and supporting each other and being aware of what the situation is can be really helpful. I was just reflecting on that.
There's that, and I think the problem for a lot of receptionists though is they feel if I put the phone down on this person, which I should do because they've been abusive to me and that's our policy, the patient will then go and complain to the practice manager that I've put the phone down on them. That's going to create work for the practice manager who's already busy enough as it is, and then we'll have to kind of apologize to the patient that happened and we're sorry they feel that way, and then the patient is going to feel like they've received an apology and we've done something wrong. And I think that's the thing that goes through a lot of these staff heads when that happens is it's not just, there's a policy that says he shouted at me, he's sworn at me, I should put the phone down. They just think of all these things that are going to happen if I put the phone down. And that's why they stay on the phone. And that's why they end up taking a lot of it.
And how do you stop that from happening? How do you interrupt that cycle?
Me as a practice manager, I say put the phone down, and if they write a complaint to me, they'll get the response in the form of me putting the phone down on them. But I don't think everyone is like that, and I think we need to, as a profession and as an industry, we need to be more firm in enforcing that policy and saying that it's not okay. We're not the only part of the NHS that's guilty of this. You see so many times patients who turn up at A&E inappropriately, kick off, and yet they don't get banned from the hospitals. I think the NHS is far too nice for its own good sometimes, and it needs to do more to protect its staff, because without the staff, there isn't an NHS.
Here.
No, I agree. I guess the additional point I would put in is that sometimes it's important to also hear both sides of the story. I completely agree with supporting our reception teams is paramount and important, but also recognizing that sometimes we do get it wrong. And that's talking as a patient as well, having to have contacts with my own practices and my family's contacts and stuff. And similarly, patients' contacts. Sometimes we do get it wrong. It's accepting that it does happen, not often, but it does. And then also having that learning episode from it. So, one of the things we've encouraged is that doing, reviews in terms of some of the contacts that we have within the practice, just to see how we can improve things. Because actually, as much as we would like to say that we never get it wrong, we don't. We do get it wrong sometimes. But you're right. That zero tolerance policy has to be there when those contacts happen. Because even if the patient has had a bad experience, if they're in pain or if they're having difficulties, that doesn't excuse personalized offensive behavior. There's never an excuse for that. You can sometimes understand them a bit better and be more empathetic to the situation, but that doesn't give an excuse for that to continue happening. That's why I think, for many, that in particular, that video has been so impactful as a result of doing stuff. Cool. So I know we've had a couple of comments come through, and ones that we haven't kind of shared and stuff. But feel free to have a look at them. I'm not going to bring any more on the screen and things, because I think a lot of them talk around some of the key points that we've had. There's ones about the housekeeping stuff that we talked about, and various other things. I guess what we would like to finish off on though, Robin, is we've
Mm.
talked about the IGPM and the support that you guys are offering to practice management. I'm not going to say managers; it's the team itself.
Mhm.
Where should people go if they want to find that kind of support and contact and stuff?
Yeah, so you can become a member if you have any kind of managerial role within general practice. So it's including managing partners, PCN managers, assistant managers, finance managers, ops managers. So yeah, if you can go to our website, igpm.org.uk /membership if you're looking to sign up. But you can find on there all of our activities so far, the recordings of webinars that we've hosted with members, and you can contact us through that website as well. We're keen to have lots of feedback from PMs and their associates in the industry and what issues they want us to tackle for them, what we need to take forward on their behalf. So yeah, please do get in touch.
And as always, EGP learners, if you do have any comments or questions, feel free to let us know. And myself and Andy always have to try and respond and feedback into that. We're going to be back in a few weeks. I think we're taking a partial break, aren't we, next week, Andy? Just to give ourselves some catch-up time, and with it being half term and stuff, we'll be back after that. So definitely feel free to contact us for further stuff. I think we've got the structured medication reviews and things coming up as well. And we've got loads of other content coming through in the next few weeks, especially our System 1 Facebook Users Group Conference and BPC Conference in the coming months. If you do have any comments or questions, let us know. And as always, EGP Learning is here to help save you and your patients time. I'll take hands in primary care and learning. We'll catch you in the next episode. See you later. Bye, Jeff.
Bye.
Bye.